In May 1945, northwestern Germany was a landscape of skeleton-thin trees and hollowed-out buildings. The Third Reich was collapsing. But for Greta Hoffmann and thousands of German women held in POW camps, the terror was just beginning. For years, Nazi propaganda had whispered a dark warning. The Canadians are savages. They are bloodthirsty colonials. If you fall into their hands, expect no mercy. Greta stood in a makeshift Canadian field kitchen, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her tin plate. A Canadian soldier, tall, battle-worn, and wearing a dust-covered maple leaf on his shoulder, held out a tray of fresh, golden-brown donuts. Greta looked at the sugar-dusted pastry, then at the soldier. To her, this wasn't just food. It was an impossibility. In a world where she had seen people fight over rotten potato peels, this abundance felt like a trap. She asked with complete seriousness, "Is this for the pigs?" The Canadian soldier didn't laugh. He didn't shout. He simply smiled, broke a donut in half, ate one piece, and handed her the other. In that one bite, the war didn't just end for Greta. The lives of an entire regime shattered. To understand the weight of that donut, we have to look back 6 months. While the world was celebrating the liberation of Paris, the people of the Netherlands were entering a living hell known as the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. The Nazi occupiers, in a final act of spite against the Dutch resistance, had cut off all food and fuel shipments to the northern provinces. As the canals froze solid, 4.5 million people were trapped in a frozen cage of starvation. Imagine a mother in Amsterdam, her breath visible in a room with no heat, watching her children's eyes grow sunken and dim. Families were forced to eat tulip bulbs, bitter, dry, and barely edible, just to keep their hearts beating. They ground up sawdust to add volume to what little flour they had. By the time the Canadian First Army arrived, the Dutch people weren't just waiting for soldiers. They were waiting for a miracle. The Canadian soldiers who crossed the border into the Netherlands were not the savages the German propaganda described. These were boys from Ontario, farmers from the prairies, and woodsmen from British Columbia. They had just fought through the nightmare of the Scheldt and the mud of the Rhineland. They were tired, they were grieving their fallen brothers, and they had every reason to be bitter. But when the tanks of the 1st Canadian Armored Brigade rolled into the starving towns, the soldiers saw something that broke their battle-hardened hearts. They saw children who looked like old men. They saw girls who couldn't even stand up to cheer. The Canadian response wasn't a military protocol. It was a human one. Without waiting for orders from high command, Canadian privates began emptying their own rucksacks. They threw tins of bully beef, bars of Hershey's chocolate, and packs of cigarettes into the crowds. For the German posts watching from the sidelines, this was a psychological earthquake. They had been told the Canadians were the Devil's Brigade, ruthless killers who took no prisoners. Instead, they saw soldiers who were giving their own rations to the very people they had just defeated. In the eyes of the Canadian hero, there was no enemy once the white flag went up. There were only hungry mouths dotting the liberated zones. The Canadians didn't just set up outposts. They set up bakeries. The smell of fresh white bread, something the Dutch hadn't seen in 5 years, began to waft through the ruins. This white bread became a symbol of the Canadian spirit. It wasn't the gray, grit-filled loaf of the occupation. It was soft, it was pure, and it tasted like hope. One Canadian veteran later recalled, "We didn't feel like conquerors. We felt like older brothers coming home to a family that had been starved." This compassion was the ultimate psychological warfare. It proved that the Allied cause wasn't just about winning a war. It was about restoring humanity to a world that had forgotten what it looked like. While the Canadian ground troops were sharing their chocolate bars, a much larger catastrophe was unfolding. Millions were still trapped behind German lines in Western Holland, and they were days away from total starvation. General Eisenhower and the Allied command knew that if they didn't act, they would liberate a graveyard. That's when the Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, was called upon for a mission that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. It was called Operation Manna. For years, Canadian Lancaster bombers had flown over Europe to drop fire and destruction on the Nazi war machine. But on April 29, 1945, the mission changed. The bomb bays weren't loaded with high explosives or incendiaries. They were packed with sacks of flour, dried eggs, peas, sugar, and tins of milk. The Canadian pilots flew so low sometimes, just 50 feet above the ground, that they could see the Dutch people waving from their rooftops. There were no parachutes. The bags of food were simply dropped into open fields. To the starving people below, it looked like snow made of flour. They called it bread from heaven. One Canadian pilot later wrote in his logbook, "I saw people dancing in the streets. They weren't running from the bombers. They were chasing the shadows of our wings." This was the ultimate Canadian flex, not of power, but of heart. But what about the enemy? As the Canadians pushed deeper into northwestern Germany, they encountered thousands of German prisoners of war and female camp personnel. These people had been fed a steady diet of Goebbels' propaganda. They expected the savages from the north to put them against a wall. Instead, they met the Canadian character. In the POW camps managed by Canadians, the treatment was so humane it felt like a psychological trick. German officers who had been taught that might is right were baffled when Canadian medics treated wounded German teenagers with the same care they gave their own men. This wasn't just being nice. This was a calculated display of Canadian values. They wanted the world to see the difference between a regime that starved its own people and a democracy that fed its enemies. When those German women in the camps saw Canadian soldiers laughing, playing harmonica, and handing out cigarettes, the Nazi master race theory died a silent death. They realized they hadn't just lost a war. They had been liberated from a lie. The Canadian mercy was more effective than any propaganda film. It turned enemies into people who simply wanted to go home and rebuild. The war ended in May 1945, but the bond between Canada and the Netherlands became eternal. When the Dutch royal family returned from exile in Canada, they didn't just bring back their titles. They brought back a deep love for the maple leaf. As a thank you for liberating their country and for providing a safe haven for Princess Juliana during the war, the Dutch people sent a gift that still blooms today. Every single year, the Netherlands sends 20,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa, Canada's capital. These tulips aren't just flowers. They are a living memorial to the Canadian boys who never made it home. Each bloom represents a stomach that was filled, a life that was saved, and a child who grew up because a Canadian soldier decided to share his rations. When you walk through the Canadian War Cemetery in Grosbeek, you see thousands of white headstones. The Dutch locals to this day adopt these graves. Dutch school children are taught to tend to these headstones, ensuring that the names of the liberators from the north are never forgotten. They remember the soldiers who didn't just bring guns, but brought the white bread of freedom. Being a Canadian hero in World War II wasn't just about the Victoria Cross or the medals on the chest. It was about the dignity shown in the ruins of a collapsing world. It was about the soldier who saw a starving girl and saw his own sister back home. The story of the Canadian donuts, the chocolate bars, and the bread from the sky is the true legacy of the 1st Canadian Army. They proved that you can be the most feared force on the battlefield and the most compassionate soul in the kitchen. They left Europe not as occupiers, but as legends. And as the world moved into the Cold War, the memory of that first bite of freedom remained a flickering light in the hearts of millions. If this story of Canadian grit and grace moved you, then you owe it to these heroes to keep their memory alive. Hit that like button and subscribe to Canadians in War.